Hello, Sue.
Hi, Bernie.
We are here in Derry, actually together in the same space, which
Perfectly
is
socially distanced and
perfectly
everything.
socially distanced, but I may be a bit overexcited about seeing real people. And this is a lovely event. Very, very delighted to be here to help to launch Guard Your Heart, which is your debut novel. And I would love it if you would kick us off with a reading from the book.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I haven't actually got the proper Guard Your Heart copies. I think they're in the post, so this is from the proof. But this is an extract where Aidan's reflecting back on the first time that he's met Iona. So it's fairly early on in the novel. After leaving the cafe, we dawdled over the brick cobbled crest of Butcher's Gate and past the railings fronting First Derry Presbyterian Church. I smirked at a memory, me, 10, sprinting after Sean like a blue arse fly down the banking after paintbombing its Greek columns one July night. God, but Ma had lit into us after dragging the explanation for the yellow gloss off our runners. Da's cigarette had wobbled as he tried not to laugh. I could see Iona wondering why I was smiling, but I'd kept my thoughts private. For all I knew, it could be her church. The rain had emptied the walls of all but a handful of Yanks with oversized raincoats and bum bags as we dandered past St Augustine's. It suited me fine not to bump into anyone I knew. God knows what rumours I'd have generated walking up the town with a new sidekick, and a Protestant at that. During the Troubles, the walls hosted a green British Army observation tower like a misplaced Lego build. I was around 6 when I remember Da pulling in our old Skoda at Free Derry Corner and dragging my attention off the Nintendo DS up to where they were ripping off the iron cladding. Changing times, demilitarisation, days when the walls were gated and locked for every old firm match and only the maddest entrepreneurs were wittering about tourist dollars. In the 70s, the IRA blew the 90-foot pillar top with Governor Walker sky high. It had towered over the bogside, imposing its Britishness on the Catholic houses huddled in the terrace streets below. Da had revelled in telling glory stories of chunks of its rubble decorating bogside mantelpieces. Rose-tinted bedtime stories, delivered with slurred words and the smell of beer. Iona and I walked past the pillar stump and the trees on Grand Parade to the orange brick of the Verbal Arts Centre. To imagine, to create, to learn, read the stone plaque over its door. Fine if you're 5 and playing with plasticine. In the good old days, we played with grey plasticine that smelled of Christmas and went boom, my da used to brag. Part of me still wished I was 5. It was easier to know who you were in them days. I glanced at Iona. Best to keep radio silence on the IRA family heritage. I couldn't resist clambering on the cannons at the double bastion overlooking the bogside murals. Iona had looked up as I'd grinned like a maniac, delicately balanced with my arms held wide on the barrel of roaring Meg. Have you ever broken a bone? She'd asked. You my guardian now? I'd laughed back, raising my bandaged fingers. I'd broken my left arm when I was 5, running too fast down Craigan Hill after a football. When I was 7, I badly sprained an ankle playing Superman off a 5-foot wall in our playground. At 10, I turned my big toe licorice after busting it with a brick on a building site at dusk. Ma was a season ticket holder at A&E. So what are you for now, school's out? I'd asked Iona as I straddled the barrel, watching her gaze over the ramparts down the grass to Free Derry Corner. Her heart was set in studying English at Queen's University in Belfast. I must have skipped school the day they taught decision-making. My crystal ball was drowned in slurry somewhere. I had an offer from Queen's too, but I'd fit university like a fart in a wetsuit. Middle-class bollocks. Our clan were smart like, but no one had a mortarboard photo over the fireplace. Saoirse could make anyone do anything. Sean quit school early over his dyslexia, but he could wire everything. Cars, radios, your head with bloody community politics. No one really had any expectations of me, except myself after a few pints. Then I'd be for taking on the world. Aunt Teresa needed prayer when I scraped enough GCSEs to get back into year 13. My teachers needed vodka.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. It's lovely to hear Aidan's voice from the book, and it's one of the things that struck me in the very early reading of it was how strong that voice was. He was there, fully formed from the word go, and Just to give a little bit of background maybe on the book itself, so we start in June 2016 on the last day of the last exam that Aidan is sitting in his school in Derry. And the book then covers quite a bit of ground, not so much in terms of time. It's only really one summer. The bulk of the book is really, the bulk of the action takes place over one summer, but certainly a lot happens within those pages and within that period of time. I wanted to ask you about the voice of Aidan and the voice of Iona, because there are two main protagonists.
Yeah.
So Aidan sets off, finishes his exam, goes home and has a sleep, but then heads out to a house party, and that's really the start of a whole series of events that happen over the course of that summer, in which he meets Iona, and that's the most significant part of it, really. And I wanted to ask you about those two voices, about Aidan's voice and Iona's voice, and were they there right from the beginning, or did the books begin in a different way? Tell us a bit about how it started for you.
Yeah, I think it began with Aidan. I remember at the time that I was thinking of writing this was actually the time that the book is set in. So I was starting to write this in summer 2016, and I work in peace and reconciliation for the day job, and what was going on at that time in that field of work was the whole talk about the decade of centenaries, which was the 100th anniversaries of the massive events that shook Ireland and formed the legacy that we all live with today. And in 2016, it was 100 years after the Somme and the Easter Rising. So there was a lot of talk about that and how we should reflect on that. And my brain was just spinning, saying, but who's telling the story of now? Who is actually saying what it is that people are living in now? Who's writing that for Northern? And of course, now I know there are some people, particularly there's brilliant crime writers and all that type of stuff, you know, and there's a few other young adult writers. But that was the stuff that I knew about, and it was that thing of write what you know. And Aidan's voice just came to me as a young lad from Cregan. As you know, both he and Iona have the connection. They're both born on the day of the Good Friday peace deal. And the thing in my head really was, what is the story of the generation that didn't live a day in the Troubles, that came after that, but are still grappling with the whole legacy of things? And from the start, with the dual narrative thing, it was Aidan that was true and clear right from the start. And I think I honed him a lot. He got a lot of freedom after I'd written a full first draft of it. And then I read a couple of books. One was The Glorious Heresies by Lisa McNerney, and the other was Paul McVeigh's Good Son. And Aidan is not the same as either of those protagonists, but they are both two young male protagonists from Ireland, different ends of it really. But I think I learnt then what voice was about. And also the freedom to just go for a voice. And Aidan came out of that. And Iona needed to be there in the story, because how could you tell the story of Northern Ireland today unless you had multiple perspectives, and particularly at least two from, you know, the main communities, so to speak. There's many communities here, but from those two communities. And for a long time after Aidan was honed and perfected, Iona was still a mess, because I just couldn't write a female narrator. I was really struggling to make her strong. And then it was that whole thing of, if you want a character to come alive, make something bad happen to them. And as soon as I did that, Iona just came to life as well. So
they're wonderful characters. They are fully three-dimensional, four-dimensional, five-dimensional. They, the interest in the story is when they meet, and all of what they're carrying and all of what's around them becomes the challenge for them in terms of who they are and where they're coming from. The piece that you read there had a lovely flash of humour at the end of it, and it also, I want to talk a bit about that, but it also takes us on a walk around the city walls. And I don't know the city all that well, But it really struck me when I was reading it that I felt like I was being taken on a kind of a journey around, and there are various landmarks. There are places that we've all heard of, but then there were other places that would be less familiar to me. And then there are the places that they go to outside of the city, because they have a couple of day trips, but both north to Downhill and Mussenden, and then south to Angrain and Shiland. I wanted to ask you about that, because that really interests me. What came first, I suppose, is the question. Did you think, I want to evoke this place really well? Or did that happen quite naturally, in the sense that once, as they were going about their business, they ended up in these places that you present to us?
I think it's probably a bit of both, Bernie. I mean, I wrote my first draft completely naively, not having a clue what I was taking on. So a lot of those place settings did happen naturally, but what I would say looking back on it, and which I think I honed, was that, why set every scene in your kitchen over a cup of tea when you can put it somewhere that actually adds, something to the story as well. And I love the city that I live in. I mean, I'm from Armagh, but I've lived in Derry, Londonderry, Durra, over 20 years now, and I think it's a great city. And I suppose if I was going to tell a story that showed the hard edges of some of the difficult things that we're dealing with as a legacy of conflict, it was really important to me not to write off the city when I was doing that, but actually to show the genuine vibrancy. So you have things like, the Foyle Maritime Festival with the clipper yachts coming in is a great backdrop, or, when they're on the city walls, or Guildhall Square, or even, when Aidan's sitting over in Craigan Cemetery. I mean, stunning view of the entire city from there, or on the waterside, the Abrington sites and Columns Park. The city has amazing backdrops. And then it felt natural that if these two young people were trying to get to know each other, but with difficult sort of people looking over their shoulders maybe, that some of the scenes could be outside of the city. And I mean, those are some of my favourite places in the world, Angrain and Fort, or Mussenden Temple. So why not throw them in? They're the hinterland of the place.
Do a bit for the tourist board while you're here. Yeah, I really love that. And I love the relationship between the two of them, Aidan and Iona, and that's the relationship that's at the centre of the story. And it's really fast-paced. Those events that kick off on that first day of the book, things just seem to get worse and worse and worse for these two. They face all the challenges that young people in the Western world face. They have exam pressure, they have the tyranny of social media, all the navigation around, relationships and the difficulty of consent, and that all comes into the book, as well as quite dark issues around substance misuse. But then they've also got all the particular challenges of this particular place at this particular time. So they're also dealing with sectarian violence, they're dealing with extortion, with blackmail, with an attempted suicide. There are lots of issues that are very serious here, and they're navigating those between them. But there's so much tenderness and grace in the scenes where they are alone together, where they're, navigating this new relationship. And I wanted to ask you, did you know you were writing a romance? Did you know you were writing a boy meets girl story?
Yes and no. I mean, the publisher will probably kill me if I say no, it wasn't a romance from the start. Of course it was a romance from the start, Bernie. Yes, it's a romance. Actually, I think what it is, I seem to have an unnatural interest in sort of that teen angst, all those big emotions that teenagers go through.
Everything is accelerated and amplified.
Exactly. So it's not just love. I mean, some of the stuff that they go through, I mean, there's hate, there's disappointment, there's pain, there's hope, there's that whole big canvas of emotions. Really, if you can nail that realistically in the plot, it's such an opportunity to write the scenes that make you laugh and cry. And you mentioned about the tough issues that are in there, and it was important to me to write the tough issues because this city has tough issues, but this city also has a cracking sense of humour running through absolutely everything. And the coping mechanism that people have here for dealing with the rubbish stuff is to laugh their way through it, to the deadpan wry humour that we're not letting on what's going on, and the self-depreciation and everything that's just so wonderful. I mean, that's what I miss during the COVID lockdown, that you don't get to sit on the park bench or on the bus or, in the cafe and overhear the amazing stuff that people are just, did you just wonder, I'm going to get that as a line in there somewhere, So my thanks to the people of the city for just that, the cultural richness of here that allows you to lace the heavy stuff with the fun stuff, because I don't think I have it in me to write something that would leave people with a weight of heaviness and depression and flip at the end of this. I wanted it to be something that would make people think about the issues and maybe allow their own challenging to think and reflect. But I didn't want to leave them feeling with any sense of hopelessness, because ultimately I think this city has an amazing story of peace to tell. Sometimes other people tell this place as a place of conflict, but where I think we're at now, there is a lot of hope. There's challenges to it, but it is a place with a lot of hope and a lot of spirit and a lot of buoyancy, and I hope that the humour catches that, and the way people prevail through issues is caught in the book.
It certainly feels hopeful to me reading it. There's certainly times when your heart is in your mouth, because it seems like things are so difficult for them, but it certainly does feel hopeful. And the humour is wonderful. There's some fabulous lines. I don't want to say too much about it because I really want people to meet them and enjoy them, but just in connection with that, I was really struck as well in the book by the secondary characters and by the role that they play in the book, because we have Aidan and Iona at the centre, we have their family members, but we have a number of characters who really have pivotal parts to play in their journey. And I have my own personal favourites.
Who's that? Go on, you have to tell me.
Well, I'm going to say two. I have two. So I have Paddy, who is a painter decorator who's a contemporary of Aidan's father. And who knew Aidan's father, and who does step into that role in a certain sense as the father figure to Aidan. And he is just so wise and so available to Aidan when he needs someone. I find that very touching. So I have a very soft spot for Paddy and for the Paddies of the world. But I also really like Aidan's friend Connell. And Connell comes out with one of the best lines in the book for me. This is the philosophy by which I'm going to live my life now, okay? So they're in the pub and there's been a difficult scene, and Aidan leaves the pub in a bit of a state. Connell follows him. And they have a chat. Aidan's he's not the most articulate. He's not the best at expressing what's going on with him. As readers, I think a lot of the time we're there saying, just tell someone, Aidan, just talk to someone about what's happening.
He's a dairy lad, you know what I mean?
So he doesn't really say very much, but he says a bit. And then Connell says to him, if you're male and you're 18 and you're in doubt, there's only one solution: curry chip, sit in the wall and meditate. And
outside the Celtic chippy, it had to be done. It had to be out.
It's so good. And I'm thinking, that's my solution from now on too. Just take a moment, have some carbs, and, things will get better. Sit in the wall, think about life. But do you have characters that you, apart from Aidan and Iona, who we've all fallen in love with, but are there other characters in the book?
Definitely. And I suppose it's that sense that there's an African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child, And actually, Aidan's Irish teacher has another one. It's Molyneux agus Chuckishi, praise the youth and they will flourish. And I think that there was that dilemma, which I only learned naively after I'd written the first draft, that when you're writing a novel, don't have too many characters because it kind of pulls the reader all over the place. But I had written it with these characters that were there because there was the sense that if Aidan was going to get through the stuff, or if Iona was going to get through her side of it, there needed to be other people around them who, at the right time, in the real way that someone speaking a wise word of hope to a young person at the right time in their life can be instrumental in keeping them in a good direction for them. And there's the sense of that with these two, and especially Aidan. So yeah, I love Paddy as well. And I mean, partly Paddy's in there because he's reflective of characters I would know working in peace and reconciliation. I mean, Paddy's a political ex-prisoner. Yeah. And for some people, they would have such a negative stereotype of what that means. So it was really important in Aidan's community to have Paddy in there as a human being who just getting on with his life, I love Nan as well. Yeah. I mean, Aidan's Nan, she has dementia. Sometimes she's with it, sometimes she's not, but she has a pivotal role in there in her own wee way. Or the other character on Iona's side that I really like, and some people have picked up on some of the early reviews, is Andy. Because again, Andy is Iona's brother, and he's a bandsman. He plays his flute and he's in his marching band in the summer, and he's a loyalist and he's proud of it. But he's a key character in this, and his maturity, gradually shows through, and his road to understanding, to embracing the change that he's seeing in society and where he's going with that. And I suppose what I was deliberately doing throughout the novel was laying the ground that some people think that it's the middle of the road people that build peace. But from working in peace for the time that I have done and working in this city, I don't think that's true. I think it's the people that have most to lose. The people that have the strongest identities on what either side that is, that know what this means to them, that are prepared to come together with the most courage and the most truth and honesty in looking at the difficulties. And they're the ones, the civic voices, the communities that really lead on peace building. And so there's a range of that in the novel. And I suppose as well, it's important to say, because we're talking about two sides here, but actually in the book there's hints that there's more, the refugees are there. There's a wonderful Filipino nurse in the story that helps Aidan at a certain time to, so there's more diversity in there.
There is. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because Aidan and Iona, they spend a certain amount of time looking back, a little bit of time looking back and thinking about the past. And they spend a certain amount of time looking in at the city, in at themselves, in at the people closest to them. But they also spend time looking out of the city as well, and looking further than that, and looking to the future too. And they, Iona has the posters on the wall, Malala and Mandela. Aidan's sister, Saoirse, is in South America. They're the Syrian refugees who come to the barbecue. There are lots of nods to the bigger, wider world, and to what's possible and what can happen as well. And I think that's really interesting. That did strike me when I was reading it. There's a conversation that Iona has with her mother in the car one day. They're coming back from Limavady, and it's just one of, I think, the best scenes in the book. It's one of my favourite scenes, and there's a kind of it's almost subtitled. If it were a scene, on screen, I think we would have asides or subtitles. And it's one of those conversations that many of us have had. We recognise it. It's the decoding conversation about, so the mother is asking Iona about this boy that she's seeing, and there are questions about where he's from, where he went to school, about his parents, and the pictures.
And it's really all asking, what religion is he? Tell me what religion is he?
That's the question behind it. And we've all had those conversations. But there's one moment, and it passes over fairly quickly, but there's a moment in which Iona looks out the window and she sees the sign as they're driving back into the city, and she just comments about the road sign, that when you're coming in from the city from this side, the London of Londonderry on the road sign is rarely painted out, as it is when you're entering the city from different areas. And it struck me that was a very interesting comment in terms of your experience of a place, of a situation, of a relationship may well depend on your angle of approach.
Yeah.
And she nails that in that scene in which her mother is, interrogating her partly subtly to try and find out who this boy is. And I just wondered, because I know that you've done so much work in peace building, you have a background in conflict and peace studies. You were bringing that to the book, but were you aware that you were bringing it at the time that you were writing?
Yes,
you were.
I definitely was. And that was a big part of the reason, I think, of wanting to write this, apart from the fact that I suddenly realised I enjoyed writing, was that in my work in peace building, what I've seen over the years is if you can reach somebody's empathy with somebody that is different to them, they don't have to agree, they don't have to understand everything, but if they can suddenly empathise with the other person's humanity, then suddenly you have a connection. And a lot of peace work is about trying to help people empathise with the other, whatever that is. And, literature, writing has such a powerful way of doing that I thought, if I could nail that, couldn't I tell the story to a wider audience that maybe wouldn't attend a community event or something, or hasn't the time to engage in something, but might read a few chapters of a book some evening and think about something. And that's really where that came. And there's occasional lines in there, that are more pertinent to some of those thought processes. But mainly the important thing was to make it that this is not a textbook. This is a fast-paced, contemporary story of life that hopefully draws you into it, and you're not realising that. But maybe when you close the cover at the end, that moment when you read a good book and you close it at the end, you think, that's the moment that's important in this. And you'd mentioned about how Aidan and Iona have worldviews on things and bring some of that in. And I think actually in reading books, it's the ones that talk about race that actually have the most resonance to hear, because there aren't books out there about sectarianism the same way. But if you read Angie Thomas, The Hate You Give, or Noughts and Crosses, or what I grew up reading was the Wilbur Smith stuff set in South Africa, that was the whole story of apartheid, where you can actually use the context of something real. I know in Noughts and Crosses it's not real, but The Hate You Give, for example, set in a real society with real issues about race relations in America, but a fictional story that pulls you in and helps you understand something. And that's what I would hope in its own way that Guard Your Heart would actually do.
I certainly think it does. I wish it had been around when I was the age of Aidan and Iona in the story. A book like this, I would never have encountered a book like this, that held a mirror up to the community, and to the world that we live in. It's such an important contribution. So I wanted to ask you about just a little bit about your what it looks like when you're writing. So if we were to look in the living room window, or the room of or the window of the room that you write in.
I'd have to tidy it before you look in, Bernie. Nobody's been in the house for so long.
Forget about that. What would we see? Would we see someone working on a laptop? Would we see someone with notebooks? Would we see someone with big charts who's plotting the story? How do you work?
That process has grown because I made all the mistakes in book one. you'll know yourself, part of our connection was that I landed into one of your writing classes that in the Verbal Arts Centre one cold winter evening, and I remember discussion around the table, and yes, I have written a first full draft of a novel, but then it had so many edits to go through because I learnt all the mistakes that I'd made and had to hone it and learn how to do all that, So my writing process in writing Guard Your Heart was very much being stuck in the house as a single parent on cold, dark winter evenings and having had years of watching all the telly that I could thole, and enough was enough, switch the telly off and do something better with my time. And it was always the late hours when my son was in bed. And now that he's a teenager, those hours have gone and the writing process is chaotic, to say that. But in those days, it was sort of from 8 o'clock at night or maybe 9 o'clock and spend a couple of hours and just each night do a bit on it. I hadn't a clue about plotting. I did not plot, made all the mistakes with the first novel and then had to weave some stuff into it, which is far more complicated. So for book 2, I did learn and I read, Into the Woods and those kind of things and learnt how to plot. And I think got better at that in a first draft version, second time round,
Mm-hmm. And what you mentioned the next book. Can you tell us anything about it? Can you?
Yes, kind of sneaky preview. It has a working title of Truth Be Told, and it's similar to Guard Your Heart in that it's contemporary Northern Ireland young adult crossover type thing, and probably the same blend of issues and a bit of dry humour in there. All that's the same. But the different thing is this is set in 2019. And having learnt how hard I found writing a female protagonist, I ridiculously threw myself into the thing of let's have 2 female protagonists in the next one. Why not challenge yourself at what you're not good at, and pick it up like. So I have 2 16-year-olds, 2 girls in 2019 who are in 2 different parts of Northern Ireland. One is in Derry, one is in rural Armagh. And the front story of the novel is that they meet on a cross-community residential, as young people do here, and the shock is that they both look virtually identical. And then that bodes the question, are they related? What is the relationship? Is there a connection? And ultimately, they go on a kind of quest to see, might they share the same father? And who would that be? And where is he? So that's the front story, but what you're really seeing a story of is both Northern Ireland in 2019, which was the big backdrop of 2.5 years of no government, of human rights legislation around equality issues, LGBT, abortion rights, the rights of victims and survivors to have pensions. That was the whole political context here. But the other thought in my head was, if Guard Your Heart was telling the traditional story, in a sense, of the divide here as it's seen, then I needed to do something that told something different. So if Guard Your Heart is about conflict and peace, Truth Be Told is really about truth and forgiveness. That's your GCSE theme, question, answer. It's about truth and forgiveness. But it's really telling the stories that don't fit the common narrative of here and telling the stories of women from multiple generations through the conflict, I suppose. Is that enough of a preview?
That's a great preview. That's a great preview. I love the sound of it. So I just want to say thank you very much. And I'm sure that everybody is with me when I wish you all the very, very best with this brilliant book that everyone has to read. We don't have the copies that are going to be in the bookshops, but we have these gorgeous, glossy, goldy, shiny things. I have absolutely loved it. I wish you all the very, very best with it, and I'm sure that great things will happen. And thank you very much for the chat.
Thank you so much.